we've already talked about why some men end up being perpetually single and alone. So now let's talk about how men actually live their lives as involuntarily celibate men. How do they cope? Well, I'll go ahead and tell you right now, there's really nothing you could do as an involuntarily celibate man that's going to make you truly content. You can have moments where you feel content, and maybe you can even manage to scrounge up some happiness from time to time. But when you are a man with a functioning libido and you just cannot find a partner no matter how hard you try, then at best, your baseline state of being is going to be, at best, mild depression. So what I want to do for this video, I'm going to go over some of the most common methods that involuntarily celibate men use to cope with their situation, and I'm going to do my best to describe for each coping method how well it actually works, why certain men might be more or less susceptible to trying out a given method, and I'm going to try to give some insight into any potential psychological effects that a particular coping method might lead to. So this video is not me trying to rank different coping methods or recommend any particular coping methods. This is just for educational purposes, and my hope is that maybe some regular normal people might see this and they might come away from it with a better understanding of what involuntarily celibate men go through. And maybe, just maybe, they might have a little more sympathy for these men. Because the involuntarily celibate male population, it's a lot bigger than you might think, and it's growing rapidly, both in raw numbers and on a per capita basis. So whether you like it or not, the involuntarily celibate are living amongst you. They are your coworkers, your family members, the guy that delivered your Amazon order. They're all over the place. So I hope I can at least give you something to think about, if nothing else. These coping methods tend to fall into either one of two categories. There's coping methods that are goal-driven. So these are copes that a man will do when he still feels like there is some hope left for him. So with these goal-driven coping strategies, the coper is actually trying to improve himself in one way or another. So essentially, deep down, the mechanism behind these goal-driven copes, psychologically speaking, is that the man is coping by trying to convince himself that the self-improvement activity he is participating in is actually something that might give him real-world results that will improve his chances of attracting women. The second category of coping methods is acceptance phase copes. So these are things that a man will do for no other reason than just to try to distract himself or entertain himself. I know I'm calling these acceptance phase copes, but men at any stage of involuntary celibacy are prone to these methods. It's just that for a man that fully accepts his position as an excess male, a lifelong involuntarily celibate male, in other words, the acceptance phase copes are the only coping methods that he'll use. So a man that accepts his role in this world probably won't be coping with any goal-driven coping methods. But a man that does still feel hopeful will usually use both types of coping strategies, goal-driven and acceptance phase copes, from time to time. So that's it for the preamble. Now let's get right into it. We'll start with goal-driven coping methods. Method 1. Looks maxing. Okay, so let's start off by talking about looks maxing. Looks maxing could easily be broken down into multiple different coping methods on its own. You could consider things like lifting weights, learning how to properly style your hair, or learning how to dress better, all as their own individual goal-driven coping methods. So looks maxing is kind of a category in and of itself, but just to keep things simple, I'm just going to be talking about looks maxing in general because on a psychological level, all the different types of looks maxing are pretty much equivalent, as in the deep-seated psychological motivation that drives men to do these things is the same, or it's at least pretty similar. And the actual value in terms of coping of all the different looks maxing methods, that's also pretty similar. Sure, lifting weights and doing cardio and eating a healthier diet, these things do have added health benefits compared to, say, fashion maxing or cosmetic surgeries. So let's keep that in mind as we go over this. But ultimately, whatever specific kind of looks maxing cope a man is doing, it's not going to be something that is very likely to actually have any meaningful results in terms of actually attracting women and launching a man out of involuntary celibacy. I mean, there are edge cases where maybe a guy was just really, really fat, but he actually had a great facial structure hiding underneath all the fat. So just by losing weight, he actually goes from a 4 out of 10 to a 6 or 7 out of 10. So I will say, if a guy is obese, then losing weight can actually sometimes result in a man ascending out of involuntary celibacy. So definitely try to lose some weight if you've always been fat, but that is a rather special case. In general, gym maxing fits pretty well amongst all the other forms of looks maxing in terms of its actual usefulness, or its uselessness, rather. So when it comes to looks maxing, it mostly is not a viable coping strategy in the long term. I do think it's worth it for most men to try looks maxing at some point, not as a cope, but just because there are those rare edge cases where it actually can help a man ascend. But anything beyond like a year of effort or something like that, you're not really going to be doing anything positive for yourself. At best, you'll just be continuing to delude yourself with false hope. And that is a bad thing, because the more time and effort you spend on looks maxing, especially when you feel like you're actually noticing improvements, over time, as you see time and time again that none of your looks maxing efforts are working, nothing you're doing is actually helping you to attract women, that can be a very difficult experience to go through. You might feel like you're pushing the limits of your potential and you're becoming the best possible version of yourself. So after all that effort, when you still are not able to get a girlfriend or even land a one-night stand, what that does to a man mentally, emotionally, it's just devastating. It's like you're proving to yourself once and for all that you really are just genetically inferior. And for guys that already have that personality type where they were able to maintain hope for long enough to continue looks maxing for 3, 4, 5, even 10 years, when that realization finally hits, like, oh, okay, maybe there really isn't any hope for me. That is a volatile situation. And it can be the type of thing that sometimes could convince a man to attempt going to the side of the sewer. So, looks maxing can actually be very dangerous for certain men. And also, there are those men that they just take looks maxing way too far, where they end up getting thousands of dollars worth of cosmetic surgeries, sometimes even going into debt to get these surgeries. And that can be dangerous for multiple reasons. Cosmetic surgeries usually are not going to be enough to launch a man into ascension, so just financially speaking, it's a bad idea. And any kind of surgery, especially if there's anesthesia involved, I know we tend to think of these things as, it's all routine, it's all safe, and the current state of medical technologies is just so advanced these days, there's nothing to worry about. This is all safe. There's very minimal risk involved. But the thing is, there is risk involved with surgery. Any surgery you get, there are risks involved. Okay? And that is something you seriously need to consider. Even just getting your wisdom teeth removed or something like that, the most routine surgery you can think of, there is still risk involved with that. And call me crazy, but I would be willing to bet that cosmetic surgeons, on average, are probably not as good at their jobs as most doctors, because they obviously have no moral fiber whatsoever. They are 100% profit driven, and we know that just from the line of work that they're in. So, I don't know. I don't trust it. But either way, looks maxing might be a more dangerous coping strategy than most people realize, which really stinks because it's also extremely popular. If you're enjoying the video so far, I would really appreciate it if you could subscribe or maybe even like the video. Method 2. Money maxing or career maxing. Money maxing or career maxing, it's pretty much the same thing, is the coping method where an involuntarily celibate man just says, okay, I'm not good looking, I'm not charismatic, I'm not attracting women with my looks or my personality, so you know what? I'm just going to try to make as much money as possible, and then maybe I can attract a woman. The concept seems reasonable enough. I think even the bluest of blue-pilled normies accepts that a man's wealth is something that might make him more or less attractive to women, and I think there is some truth to that. If a man makes $150,000 a year, he's probably going to be more attractive than if he were to only make $30,000 a year. But that only really works if we're talking about the same man. And also, it only works if that man is already attractive. If we're talking about an unattractive man making $40,000 a year, and let's say he's not necessarily ugly, but he's not attractive. So basically, this is a guy that is invisible to women. If that man at $40,000 a year suddenly gets a new job and he starts making $150,000 a year, he's still going to be invisible to women. So money maxing is misguided as a self-improvement technique because increasing your wealth or your income will only really make you more attractive if you're already meeting some baseline level of attractiveness. Now, with that said, career maxing is something that a lot of men do to cope with their loneliness. And in terms of coping, it's probably one of the better coping methods out there, actually. But it just depends on the context. If a guy is spending all his time working on his own business and he manages to have some success, it might not help him attract women, so it's not going to fix the root of the issue. It's not actually going to fix his loneliness problem. But if he's actually engaged in his work, like he actually cares about what he's doing, and he's able to enter that flow state where you're just hyper-focused and it feels like time's passing by seemingly in an instant, that's not a bad way to cope, because it allows you to pass the time in a way where you're actually mentally engaged with something. So there's some sense of fulfillment there, and it should be fairly effective at keeping your mind off of the fact that women don't find you attractive. So at the very least, it's not bad for your health. It's not dangerous. Of course, what I just said only applies in cases where a man actually cares about his work and is able to find some sense of fulfillment in it. If you're busting your ass 60 hours a week, working at some pointless fake email job that makes you miserable, then that's not really effective coping. You're just making yourself more miserable. Although, maybe in some cases, working a miserable job actually might be preferable to just sitting there thinking about how lonely you are all day. But generally speaking, I don't think career maxing is usually going to be super effective as a coping strategy, and it's probably not particularly common either. I know it's something you see all over the place if you ever browse black pill communities or even red pill content on the internet. You see people talking about going monk mode and just putting their all into their careers since they think it's their best shot. But dedicating yourself to your work is an extremely difficult thing to do, even for neurotypical non-depressed people. So if you're suffering from chronic male loneliness, it's usually going to be very, very hard to actually have the consistent motivation needed to do career maxing. So most men you hear talking about going monk mode and working their butts off, they aren't even really doing it. Some do, but most aren't. And most are eventually going to end up disappointed in the end either way, when they finally realize that no amount of wealth is going to actually help them get with women. And of course, at some point, if you have like $100 million net worth or something like that, then yes, you probably could reel in some gold diggers. It still won't be real actual attraction, but it probably would be a little bit better than the alternative, I guess. It just depends on your perspective on things. But very few men will ever manage to even get to that level of wealth anyways, where it's enough to land a gold digger. So, in my opinion, career maxing, money maxing, whatever you want to call it, it's not something that is effective in terms of actually achieving your goals, but it's a decent coping strategy. It's okay for coping. Okay, so now let's talk about the purest form of coping. Let's talk about coping methods that lonely men use to cope where there's no pretenses involved. Nobody's trying to delude themselves into believing what they're doing is actually productive. It's just pure coping, where a man accepts his position in the world, understands that he will probably be lonely for the rest of his life, no matter what he does, and so all he's trying to do is just distract himself and pass the time with as little pain as possible. Method 1. Playing video games. One of the most common copes there is playing video games. And while it's not really a productive activity by any means, and it can be addictive, in the grand scheme of things, playing video games is actually one of the healthier coping methods that a lonely man could cope with. It might be bad for your posture, and it might be bad for your eyesight, but other than that, if playing games is an effective way for a man to pass the time and entertain himself and keep his mind off of all the depressing thoughts and everything that goes along with male loneliness, then that's a good thing. Obviously, it's best to have some balance with these things. Video games could be a problem if a man is just completely disregarding every other responsibility in his life. Like, you still have to remember to feed your cat, even if you're deeply engaged in a 7-hour-long campaign in Civilization 6. But that's not really a problem inherent with gaming. That could happen with any addictive cope. So, playing video games is an alright coping method, in my opinion. It's a lot better than some of the other methods we're going to be talking about. Method 2. Watching movies, shows, and videos. Another coping method that's kinda similar to playing video games is watching videos. And I'm just going to lump movies and TV shows and sports and YouTube and TikTok slop all in together here. Ultimately, passing your time and distracting yourself with movies or YouTube videos, it's not a bad way to cope. I would say it's probably a little bit worse than playing video games, since gaming probably keeps you more engaged mentally, which might prolong your mental deterioration a bit. But I don't know if that even really makes much of a difference. It just seems like it might. For the most part, if you're watching movies or shows, or even brain rot, skibbity toilet videos or whatever, it's actually one of the healthier coping methods. Of course, if you're watching Live Leak style videos depicting real life tragic situations, that's not healthy at all. That's something that could very easily amplify your anxiety or even make you develop new types of anxiety you didn't even know existed. And the same goes for true crime documentaries. I know that watching stuff like that can be entertaining in the moment, but it can also give you paranoia and increased anxiety, so that's no good. And of course, there is another specific type of video that falls into its own category, so, well, let's go ahead and talk about that now. Method 3. Videos and images for adults. Videos and images that are created for the purposes of being arousing to an audience of people 18 years of age or older. I don't want to say the word that starts with a P, but I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. This is an extremely common method of coping, and it's also extremely addictive. But the thing that makes this coping method unique is that when you are engaging in this particular cope, you're actually simulating the very same acts that you are lacking that is a major component of what makes involuntary celibacy so difficult in the first place. So, in a sense, it's actually the most direct form of coping with male loneliness, but generally speaking, I think it's just not very healthy. It is not very good for your mental health to be consuming this type of content regularly. It's like you're tricking your brain into thinking that you're actually not lonely, but you are. Now, I will say that I think some people over-exaggerate the negative effects of consuming this type of content. I think for most men, the negatives are just going to be decreased motivation, possible worsening of your depression, unrealistic views of what actual intimacy with a woman should look like, and this doesn't apply to the vast majority of men that are already in the acceptance phase, but if you somehow did miraculously find yourself in a real-life situation with a real-life woman, you might be so desensitized that you're not even able to perform. And that's not good at all. I also think it's probably not great for the human brain to be able to repeatedly and constantly simulate intimacy with new freaky females multiple times per day, every single day. I don't have any data on that, but it just makes sense that it's probably not good for you. Now, I don't think it's reasonable to tell an involuntarily celibate man that he should never consume this type of content, because honestly, that's just cruel. You know, imagine if there's a person that's really, really into cars, but they're like quadriplegic or something, so they physically are not able to drive a car, and you tell that person that they shouldn't even watch videos of cool cars because that's not real, that's not realistic. That'll give you unrealistic expectations or whatever. I mean, obviously it's not a perfect analogy, but look, if a man knows that he's probably never going to be able to actually have intimate moments with his very own sweetheart, then give him a break. He's gonna be getting on the hub from time to time, and as long as he's not doing it excessively, there's nothing wrong with that. Method 4. Substance use. One of the most dangerous methods that men use to cope is substance use. You know, drinking, smoking, injecting, insufflating, etc. There is a broad range of different substances that can be used And obviously, some of them are a lot worse than others, but none of them are harmless. I don't think I need to tell you how bad it is for you to inject heroic woman into your veins. We all know that. But when it comes to things like drinking and smoking, and even with some of the more powerful psychedelics like mushrooms, I think a lot of people really underestimate just how bad for you it can be to regularly use these things to cope. If you're familiar with my channel at all, then you probably know I'm not exactly a straight edge guy. I drink from time to time, and I've done other things in the past, so I don't think there's anything wrong with drinking, for example, if you're able to do so in moderation. But in my life, I've also struggled with addiction to tweed, which is one of those things that a lot of people seem to think is all hunky-dory, but it's really not. And it sneaks up on you too. And actually, a lot of substances are like this, but you might be using it frequently for a few weeks or whatever, and it'll feel like, okay, this is fine. I'm still on point. I could stop whenever I want. This isn't actually hurting me. It's fine. This is all fine. But then a few weeks turns into a few months, which turns into a few years, and eventually you will realize, oh, now it's like whenever I'm sober, I actually just feel worse than I did before. And oh, now I don't even enjoy gaming anymore unless I blaze up first. Oh, actually, everything just sucks more now unless I'm quote unquote enhanced. And again, obviously, if you're addicted to tweed, for example, that's not going to be nearly as bad as being addicted to Xan bars, but it's still not great. And unfortunately, when a man is a lifelong involuntarily celibate, it's pretty common for a man in that situation to think thoughts like, it couldn't possibly get any worse, so at least when I'm using my favorite substance, I can kind of forget about things for a while, so I guess it's worth it. And listen, I do understand that line of reasoning, but it's not actually true. The truth of the matter is, it could get worse. It could get a lot worse. And if you start using certain substances in excessive amounts, it probably will get worse. Okay, the last coping method I want to talk about, it doesn't really fit neatly into either of the categories I had laid out, so I'm just going to throw it in here at the end. But what it is spirituality and religion. And there's different forms of this cope, but the most classic form is the guy that, after realizing he's never going to be able to attract a woman, he decides to dedicate his life to the church, and he'll take up a position as a monk or a priest, or basically just any position where it's forbidden for him to engage in romantic relationships. I'm pretty sure there's multiple religions that have positions like this, where celibacy is a requirement to hold the position. So some of these guys are Catholic, some are Buddhist, and I'm sure other religions too, but I don't really know for sure. I'm not exactly a theocratic scholar. The reason some men cope in this way is often because they're ashamed of their involuntary celibacy, so they figure if they accept a role where celibacy is a requirement of the role, then all their friends and family will respect them more because they'll think it's his own choice that he's celibate. So basically, it's a socially acceptable position to be in for a celibate man. And in some cases, the man is even lying to himself. He tells himself, my celibacy is voluntary. It's my decision. Because, I get it. If you're actually able to convince yourself that your celibacy, the thing that causes your suffering, it's not actually anything about yourself, you convince yourself that it's just a choice that you are voluntarily making, then yeah, if you are effectively able to convince yourself of that, which I'm not sure, for most guys, I don't think that's even possible. But if you are able to do that, yeah, maybe that might be nice. That might be pretty nice. That might be an effective form of coping. Now, personally, I'm not religious. I just don't believe in any of that. But I do think for some men, dedicating themselves to their religion might actually be a pretty healthy form of coping. I mean, it could give you a sense of purpose, and you wouldn't have to worry as much about people you know and what they think about your celibacy. Because for the most part, I think most people don't really question the motivations of priests and monks all that much. Generally speaking, I think they have a positive or neutral reputation. Although, of course, it depends who you ask. There are plenty of people that absolutely hate any kind of religious figures. But yeah, I actually think that religion is one of the healthiest copes there is. But the thing about it is, not just anybody and everybody can cope using religion. Like, take me, for example. It just wouldn't work for me because I don't believe in anything supernatural, and I don't think I could believe in anything like that, even if I tried. And I'm not trying to act like I'm superior to religious people. I really don't care what other people believe in. If you're religious, that's fine. I have nothing against you. But I'm just saying the religion cope is only viable for a somewhat smaller subset of the involuntarily celibate population. But with that said, I do think it is a pretty good cope for those that do believe in that kind of thing. Now, I know obviously I did not cover every single coping method in existence. There's a lot of things I didn't talk about. Really, I know that I've barely just scratched the surface. If this video performs fairly well, I'll probably make a part 2 where I'll cover more ways that involuntarily celibate men cope with their situation. But I think I did cover most of the most common coping strategies. So if you made it this far into the video, I just want to say thank you very much for watching, and please subscribe and like the video if you think it'll help you cope. Or just, if you want to. I don't care. It's whatever. Thank you for watching.